Well, hello, drawing and painting one. Here we are, ready to think about color. So yesterday you guys watched the color theory presentation and learned about color wheels, you learned about analogous color, you learned about complementary colors, split complements, warm and cool color schemes. And so you learned a lot of technical information. Today we're going to be thinking about how you can practice some of that content with the materials that we have for your COVID-19 learning experience. Now, honestly, as I mentioned to you guys before, usually when I teach this process to students, we use acrylic paints. And acrylic paints are paints that are very, what we call opaque. The qualities of opaque paint would mean that if I paint over something with it, it's solid and we can't see through it. Watercolors, which are what you got in your take-home packs for COVID-19, are a little bit different. They're what we call translucent color. And so I'm going to be talking to you about what that means as we go through this little basic intro to watercolors. I'm actually going to be dividing this introduction into two parts. Today's is the most simple part, just to get you started on your color theory chart, and then we will add to that later. So first things first, what do watercolors look like? Well, they're actually different variations of what watercolors can look like. Watercolors can come in tubes, like you see here. This is a brand of watercolor that you squeeze out and you use it in a tube, which is similar to what you've done with a lot of acrylic paints, probably in the past in middle school. And then watercolor also can come in what we call pan watercolor. And pan watercolor is one like this one that you've used probably in elementary school. And this is what you received in your pack. So this is what I'm going to be doing today's demonstration work with, so that we keep it consistent and so that you and I are using the same material. Other things to get you prepped and to get you started. Well, we've got our watercolor. The other thing that we're going to need is you're going to need to think about getting a brush for that. Most of you are probably only going to have the brush that came in the set. Okay, and if you do, that's fine. You can do everything that we're doing with just that brush. But I do want to point out a couple of things about watercolor brushes. Watercolor brushes, and again, this is like you guys, I left a lot of my materials at work, so my best watercolor brushes I don't have here. But I do want to show you the difference in a watercolor brush and an acrylic brush. So watercolor brushes tend to have a much thicker, fluffier end to them, like this one. They're very soft and very pliable, and they're designed to hold a great deal of liquid or water, hence the name watercolor. Whereas acrylic or oil brushes, which are made of a different kind of synthetic material, tend to be a little bit more stiff, they're a little bit more rigid, they're not as pliable, and they're not going to hold as much liquid. So we will be using, for most of you, the brush that you have in your set. This is another brush that came out of a watercolor set. But if you have other brushes at home, any brush will work for this. Try to find the one that works the best for you and holds the most water. The other thing that you're going to need to do is collect something to do your mixing in and something to have your water in. For watercolor, I actually strongly encourage you to have two little water trays for your watercolor work. The reason that I suggest two, if you've taken a watercolor class, you've probably heard this, but when you're working with watercolor, the first tray would be the one that you clean off most of your excess color with, and then the second container of water would be the one that you can go in and completely clean your brush, but also you can use this water to wet the pan watercolor itself, so it keeps your colors more pure. Okay, as you're working with watercolors, do keep in mind that lighter colors are going to become more contaminated as you work. So if you start with yellows and you're cleaning this out, and then you have a blue that you put in there, and then you go back to yellow, the blue from the water can contaminate that yellow. So it's a good idea to double clean your brush. Other things you're going to need in addition to the watercolor and the water and the brush, you're going to need something to put your watercolors in to do your mixing. Watercolors are not, if you're not using the tube variation, they're more of a dry process. So you're going to have to add liquid to them to be able to use them. Even the tubes, you squeeze it out, you still have to add water to it to thin it down. Most watercolor pans have this side tray, the lid, that you can do your mixing in, and that works. I tend to find that I need more space than that. And so we're in COVID-19 mode, meaning that you're not going to be going to the store to buy a palette for mixing, most of you. If you have a palette at home from your own art experiences and your own art work, that's fantastic. If not, some things that you can have around your house that work. This is a little container that little ice cream treats came in. This works really well. I like the fact that it's white because it gives you a better sense of what the color will look like when you mix with it. Similar to that, you could use, they're bad for the planet, but if you have a styrofoam egg carton, you could use that because it is not going to hold the moisture and you can mix in that. You could use even a white ice tray if you have those. Other things I really like, this is an old food tin. I think quiche came in this. And what I did is I took the top off, cleaned it really well, and then I put a piece of white paper on the bottom and then tape to hold it so that I can do my mixing in here and really see what the color is going to be. The other thing that I like about using this is then I can use this as my lid and seal it and come back to this tomorrow and use my colors again. So it extends the life of the watercolor so that you're not wasting, okay? That's another cool thing about watercolor. If we work with something today and come back to it tomorrow, any dried out watercolor in either your tray or your mixing lid, any of that stuff, if you put more water into it, it's going to reactivate the paint. So it's not wasteful, okay? You can definitely reuse these. So after you have kind of your brush, your pan, your watercolors, you've got everything ready, now we need to get set up to do some work. Eventually, we're going to be breaking it down and I'm going to be teaching you lots of different things that you can do with your watercolor. For today, we're going to keep it at its most simple. We're going to just talk about the two basic things that we're going to do with watercolor, which are the starting points, okay? Now, when we think of watercolor, I gave you guys two kinds of paper, two different surfaces. One of the papers that I gave you is just standard drawing paper. It's a 60-pound white drawing paper, and it is great for things like oil pastel. It works well for charcoal. What it does not work really great for is watercolor. The reason for that is watercolor, being that it uses a lot of water in it, would make this paper buckle, so it would make it bend and crinkle. So the actual watercolor paper that I provided you guys with, if you came and got your packs, it's going to be the paper that feels more stiff and it has kind of a cream color variation to it. So this is going to be the paper that I'm starting with today. Now let's say that you're in a pinch and let's say that you have completely lost that paper. You can use any paper that you have available to do the stuff that we're going over today. But if you're using the watercolor paper I provided you with in our packets, you're going to have more success and the watercolors just work a little better. So what you're going to notice here is I have taken a piece of watercolor paper and I've attached it to an old canvas. I have used blue painter's tape. Watercolor paper, even the good quality watercolor paper, will buckle. So what you will find if you ever take a course in watercoloring, they will actually take their watercolor paper and soak it, and then they will put it on a drawing board and staple it down, and it will dry. And what happens as that dries, the soaking it does two things. The soaking it removes what's called the sizing or the glue from the paper, and then as it dries, it shrinks and gets really, really tight on that drawing board because they go around and staple it while it's wet. And then as it dries, it tightens. And so you get a really tight, flat surface, which is really important for watercolor. Ours, we're not going to do that because you don't have access to all of that stuff. What we're going to do is Ms. T version. So you're going to take either something like the back of an old canvas. You could use a piece of cardboard if you have an old box from shipping. You could use the back of an old, even a notebook or something large like that, or if you have any kind of old drawing pad. If you don't have painter's tape, that's okay. You can use clear tape. You could even use masking tape like this if you have it around your house. The one caution with masking tape is it's super sticky, and if you put masking tape down on most papers, when you remove it, it's going to tear the paper grain. So to kind of help avoid that, if you just take your tape before you use it and put it on a piece of fabric like your shirt, you could do it on your jeans, remove just a little bit of the tacking so it's not quite as sticky, and then use that all along the edge, and that works okay too. Okay, but I had the painter's tape because I keep it in stock, so I'm going to use the painter's tape. Worst case scenario, if you don't have any tape, you're going to do it flat, but keep it as flat as you can while you're working. Maybe put books around the edges as it dries so that it doesn't warp and buckle. So after you have your paper, you have it taped down on all four sides like Miss T shows you here. Notice I didn't use little pieces and gaps, it's all the way across. After I've done that, I'm now going to show you what is the basic starting point with watercolor. Okay, there are two basic methods that we usually use with watercolor. The first is what we call wet to dry. And so to do the wet to dry method, you're going to take your watercolor, and I'm going to take a brush, and I'm actually going to use a brush that has a softer tip to it. And I advise you to, before you start using the watercolor, to come in and just kind of wet the pan, put a little water in it so it softens a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to apply it in the tip of the pan. Our first exercise, we're only going to be using 3 of the colors, and I'll go over those in just a few minutes. But so I've got this wet. If you look at it at an angle, you can see there's some liquid moving around in there, and I've wet the tip of it. Okay, as this sits on top of the pan, it's going to soften that cake of watercolor, and it will be easier to work with. It'll soften it up quite a bit. So wet to dry simply means you're taking a wet paint and you're going to apply it to a dry surface like your paper. Okay, so when I'm using a wet to dry method, you're going to notice that the color is very intense and vibrant. Okay, and it is what we call super intense. It's very pigmented. Okay, I can come in if I want to, and I'm going to save some of that red over here so I don't waste it. I can come in now behind this, and I could add additional water to this watercolor and thin it out. The more water that you add into your paint, the softer and lighter the value range is going to become. So instead of using a white colored paint to lighten a color like our red, we're going to be using more water to do that. Okay, so we're going to be using more water. I also would advise you guys to keep a towel just to dry off excess. If you feel like that edge is still too harsh, you could come in and use more water. If you feel like this is too watery, you can actually use your brush almost like an eraser to soak up some of that moisture. And we're going to be going over a lot of these steps again when we get into our experimental part with the watercolor in a little bit. But if I wanted to soften that, I could do that and let it fade. You'll also notice if you ever take a watercolor course that they very frequently will tip on their easels that they have. They're adjustable like this, and they'll tip it so that the watercolor will run in the direction that they want it to. So kind of the advantages or the reasons you would use a wet to dry method would be if you want a lot of control. So in other words, when I'm using this particular method of watercolor application, if I have a line that I'm making, it's going to stay right on that line. Okay, I can get a lot of control with that. I can get a really rich dark intensity, so I can get really, really dark color variations, a very pigmented kind of color with that method. And because of that, it allows me to do very fine details. So if I'm doing a project, I would come in and I could do very small things like little marks like this. Very fine detail marks can be made when you're using the wet to dry, okay? So you would use this in stages. Usually this is for high detail work. The second method that I want to teach you is what is called the wet to wet method. And wet to wet is a lot different when you're using it. So I'm going to start out by showing you how you would begin it. You would start, I'm cleaning my brush out in my basic cleaning water, and then I'm going to go to my clean water so I don't contaminate. And I'm going to actually physically wet the paper. Now you don't need it so wet that the water's running off the sides of your watercolor setup. You just want to soften the paper pulp. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to use my color and I'm going to put it on top of that. So I'm going to come in, we'll use red again. And when I put this down, I want to watch you to see what happens when I touch it, okay? Wet to wet gives you the potential of having very soft, faded areas of color. You can do super cool little texture things like this, where you intentionally let it curve or bleed. This is really phenomenal when you're trying to create transitions or blends of one color into another. Make sure you guys can see that. And I'm cleaning out my brush, and now I'm just gonna just kind of let the direction of the watercolor, and I'm gonna kind of let that water that's in it already, that moisture, kind of do its work. If I add more water, I can create little droplets or texture effects. Okay, it'll give me a little ringlet if I get enough water down there. Okay, and I'm not gonna lie to you, because we don't have a great number of soft bristle brushes, or I don't here. This does make it a little more challenging to blend these, but it is doable. And so these are the two variations that we're gonna start with. This is gonna be the information that you need for the first part of what we're doing with watercolor. So after, now that you've seen these two, and after you kind of get a sense of, hey, how does this work? What we're going to be doing for your first actual thing that I'm going to be grading is a color theory chart. And so I kind of want to show you guys what that's going to look like. And I'm going to show you how we're going to start ours. I'm going to move that over to the side. And I want to show you kind of what we're going to be making. So we are going to be creating something that looks like this. And this is one that I've already lined out and I've already drawn it out. I'm going to show you exactly how to do this. I have an example in the Google Doc example form, a chart. It's called the color theory chart. And you're going to be able to open that up and have it up on either your phone or your laptop as you're working to guide you through what this should look like when you're done. But in essence, what we're going to be doing is practicing using our watercolor. And we're going to be using both of these two techniques. We're going to be doing the wet to dry and some wet to wet to create some transitions in our watercolor. And in addition to that, we're going to be laying out our color theory chart based on what we've learned. So on that color theory chart, you're going to be required to have, obviously, all of the primary colors. So if you look at this one, I've already drawn it out and labeled it. And so I also am going to require that you label yours. So in addition to having it titled Color Theory Chart and Watercolor, you're going to need to have for me the names of each of the colors. So every color that I have here has its name written by it. And then you're also going to have what I call its category. And so for example, red, yellow, and blue are our primary colors. And so I have that coded up here on my key so that I know what that looks like. So that little circle, that's going to mean primary. A circle with an S inside means our secondary. So if you look here, we can find our orange, we can find our green, we can find our violet. Those are our secondary colors. Tertiary colors, I just coded those with a T. And so I have those labeled, okay? So I have those labeled for you. So how do you get to this point and kind of how do we make it look like this? Well, the first thing you're going to take is a piece of your watercolor paper. You're going to tape yours down the same way that Miss T showed you to do here. And then you're going to need to create a circle. So the first thing I would suggest is find something to help you out with this. Don't try to freehand this part. I used a bowl, just turn it upside down. You could use a saucer. You could, if you were desperate, even use the masking tape, but it's going to be easier if the bowl is like a proper cereal bowl. So then you're going to come in and we're going to draw that circle. I'm going to trace this. I would keep it on one side. You're going to notice that when you get to looking at the chart, that there's some scales on the side that I'm going to be explaining what I want you to think about in a few minutes for those. You will have to do a few of those on the side. So after I've traced this, you can see that I have a nice circle. Now, for those of you who might have done watercolor in the past, you should be keenly aware of the fact that because of the nature of watercolor and its translucent quality, translucent meaning I can see through it and the page will still show, the pencil lines that I'm drawing when I'm drawing really heavy like this will show. For this assignment, since this is just a color theory chart, that's fine. If we were doing an actual watercolor painting, we would want to use a lighter approach with the pencil, or we would want to use a watercolor pencil, which has a harder lead, which does not show, or we could even use watercolor pencils, which dissolve. But for our purposes, any pencil will do. The next thing that we're going to do is come in, and you want to get an estimate of about how big your circle is. This one is 6 inches from here down and a little bit over. So I'm going to just kind of roughly go center, make a dot. This is not mathematical. I'm not going to come in and measure this to grade you. It's more so you have an equal distribution of space. So roughly the center, you're going to come in and make a dot and then draw a line across. So you're dividing that circle roughly in half. Then what I'd like you to do, again, divide it the other way, roughly in half. And we're going to draw our circle this way. So notice that we have completely made it into like 4 sections. There are 12 colors that are on the color wheel. So there are 12 colors that we're going to have on our color theory chart. So what we're going to need to do now when we have this divided into fourths, to make it easier for you, I would suggest you just come in and make a super light mark to very roughly estimate and divide these sections into thirds. Okay, and if you take and do one side and then you take your ruler, make sure that you go through the very center and through that line that you put on that third that you drew on this side, and then draw a line straight down. It's going to roughly make the other section a third also. Okay, just like that. So now I'm going to do this one. I made my mark right here. So I'm going to put it on that side and then line my ruler up so that I have it on that third. And then it goes through the center. Just like that. And now I'm going to repeat this again. I am not, as I said, you can roughly estimate these. There are ways and methods that you could be more exact with your spacing. I just want it roughly the same. Okay, so again, I took one of my quarters and I've just roughly divided this space into 3 equal sections, made a little mark. Now I'm going to take my ruler and line it up on that mark and the very center mark that I marked first. Draw a line. And I'm going to do the last section. So that's how you're going to get your basic diagram for your color theory color wheel section. So I would go ahead at this point before you start adding any color and do your labeling. So this is going to be color theory chart. It's a good idea to put your name on it. You're going to be submitting this to me as a photograph. And even though you'll be uploading this to Schoology eventually, it's a great idea if you have your name on the photograph so that as I'm opening these and grading at 2 in the morning, I can see who I'm going to be giving the points. This section on the side, remember, we're going to be doing some smaller little things that I'm going to show you later. The other thing that I would go ahead and do at this point is label your colors. So you're going to label where the colors go. It's a great idea to reference the chart that I have posted on Schoology in that Google Doc to help you. Go ahead and put your color names down. So start with your primaries, and I'm going to move this over now so you can see this one. It's a little bigger. Start by labeling with first the primaries, and then go and follow the diagram. Remember that they're equally spaced. So these are our color triads. So we have the red, we have the blue, we have the yellow. Okay. And then also make sure that you either have the key in the corner, or if it's easier for you and you like the idea of writing primary above the red, you can do that as well. As long as I can understand that you know which of these colors mean what. That's what I'm interested in, okay? So after you get this laid out and you get your diagram down, we're now gonna come in and do our color little pie cuts, okay? And the way I'd like you to do these is I want the most intense variation of the color to be at the end near the name on the outside of the pie. And then as this moves in, we're going to be creating a variation of value. We're going to be creating lighter variations as we go down towards the center. That is called a tint, okay? A tint is when you add white to something. We're not going to be adding physical white paint because these are watercolors. We're going to let the white of the page create that tint. So I'm going to start out and let's see, I guess I could go and I'll do the red again. So I'm going to come in with my brush, and I'm going to use the brush that actually came with the set, which I will tell you is not my ideal watercolor brush. It's very small at the tip. I like slightly bigger ones. And I'm going to come in with my clean water, and I'm going to use a really nice intense red. And I'm going to do the wet to dry. So in other words, I'm not wetting my paper first. I'm just going to come in. And I'm going to try to keep this neat. I'm going to paint down until my brush kind of runs out of paint. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add water onto my brush to help me create a transition as I go down. So I'm going to come in, wet my brush. And I want this to gradually get lighter. And if you think there's too much paint left on this and it's not going to get light enough, clean your brush off. And then just take plain water. And then I'm going to add just plain water. If you think it's going to drip, I'm going to just grab that so it doesn't drip. And I'm going to create a really nice light red as I go down towards the center of my little piece of pie. So we're trying to control the amount of red as we go. Now let's say that you start out and you don't think your red near that end is dark enough, or you don't like the fade. You can come in and add additional red to it, obviously. Keep in mind, we want the darkest section of that red, the most intense, vibrant red should be right at that end. Usually when you do a second layer of watercolor, you would want to let the top layer completely dry. Because my paper is still a little wet from that water, I'm fading this in. I'm going to dry my brush off and just fade it, so that I get a really nice little fade happening. And then if you notice a little piling that happens here and it gets a little dark, I'm going to soak a little bit of that up. I'm using the tip of my watercolor brush, almost like an eraser, to lighten it. So it almost has no color right at the bottom. So that's showing me like a variation of the color as I go down. Okay, when you're starting these and when you're doing these on your own, it's going to be really important that you do the primary colors first. So in other words, I don't want you to come in and do red and then do red-orange. Okay, you're going to be doing the red, and then I'm going to come over and do the yellow or the blue. Okay, so let's say that I did the yellow next. I can rotate this. Make sure that my brushes are clean. And I'm going to use the puffier watercolor brush because you're going to get a little bit better result with that. Put some water in here in my pan. I'm going to touch that up. That line bothers me, but I'm not going to do it at this exact moment. I'm going to come in and do this one. Now, logically, it's a great idea if you start first, even though we're having 2 containers of water to do double cleaning, it's still a really good idea to do your lightest colors first. So if I were doing this as one that I was going to have graded by Miss T, so now I've cleaned my brush and I'm just going to add a little bit of water into this, I would start with my yellow so that there's no contamination in it. Clean my brush, double clean. Just plain water on the brush now to lighten that yellow as it goes down towards the center of the pie. For this exercise, you will rotate and do your primaries, and then you're going to do your secondaries. For this assignment, I'm going to have you do your own mixing. So in other words, you're not going to use the orange that is in the pan. I'm going to come in and teach you right now how to make your orange. So what we're going to do after you've got your red chunk done and you've got your yellow chunk done, we're going to come in and mix our own orange color. Now you might say, well, Miss T, how are you going to know if I use it? You will see as you're doing your mixing that the color orange that I get from mixing my watercolors together is going to be slightly different than the one that we get out of the pan. And so I will know if you're cheating. And so what I'm going to do, on one side I have the yellow, on the other side I have the red. You could do this on your larger pan and have more room to work, which is a smart idea. Because my yellow is a weaker pigment and is not as strong, I'm going to take and just gradually add a touch of red into this as I go to create my orange. Now as you're working, if you notice, hey, wow, that's kind of a yellow-orange right there, then you could do that swatch first. It's a really smart idea to have a separate piece of paper on the side, a working piece of paper to help you, to do little small swatches of your color to check and see if it's correct, to see if it's the correct orange. So I'm going to come in, and you'll notice that this orange looks very different than the orange that's in this pan, okay? The green will also look different. So with this, we are practicing our color theory mixing. And if I'd done my swatches, I would have found that I needed a little bit more red in that, but that's okay, I can go over it. And then I'm going to come in and clean this. And because there's a bluish tinge in that water, it's really important that I do the second cleaning in the cleaner water. Add my water into this and start my fade. And you know, relax. If you start the fade too soon, if something, it's okay. You know, as I've mentioned to a couple of you in email, we're learning. This is about experimenting. It's also, though, supposed to be about a time in the day for you to relax a little bit and try to do something that's not as intimidating. Hopefully, trying this on your own. It's about experimentation. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but quite honestly, I can't expect you to have as high a quality when you're doing this at home alone as I would with sitting in the room with you, helping you. I mean, I hope that it helps to have your teacher in the room with you. And so I'm going to do one more just so you can see a red-orange now. So now what I'm going to do is come in and add a little bit more red into that. Notice that the red is a really strong pigment, so it's going to drastically change that orange really quickly. And if you put it down and you start and go, oh wow, you know, that's still really, really super red, don't panic. Clean your brush, get a little more yellow. It's all good. And unlike you, you're going to be practicing doing little swatches on the side. I'm doing this so that the demo doesn't take too long. I'm doing this right away. But I have done many color theory charts in my life. So I've got a little bit more practice of eyeballing this. You will probably need to do some of this on paper to practice the colors first. If you notice that one little pizza wedge is a little too wet, you can always let it dry, take a break for a couple minutes, and then come back later. And notice that I'm rotating my color wheel as I work. When we do these in acrylics, I actually have kids create what I call color swatches that we later come in and cut out. And that's really forgiving. And what I mean by saying that is that, hey, if they mess up, we're going to cut it out anyway. So it's not going to matter if things are a little sloppy. Well, this one you do have to be a little more cautious. You guys are going to have to be a little more careful just to keep things kind of neat looking. Now I'm going to do my clean and my fade. Now this color theory chart, because of the nature of the way we're doing this and because you're going to have to be more careful, it's probably going to take you 2 days to do this. And again, you are only using the primary colors. So you're only going to be using red, blue, and yellow. So you will not be using the other colors in your pan. We will use these later. We're going to use them later, I promise. But for your mixing, it's important for me to teach you how to create the colors on your own. So this is kind of what I want you guys starting with first. You'll first, in the first day that you're working, you're going to draw this out and maybe just do 1 or 2 colors. Maybe you just do your primaries. And then we'll come in the next day and do the other section of it. On the side, you're going to notice that there are some scales on that Google Doc. I would like for you on these side scales, I'd simply like for you to do for me a paint swatch of the primaries. If you want to do the same kind of little circles like is in the diagram, that's fine. If not, just do a little swatch, a little square of each of the primary colors. I'd also like for you to do the secondary colors and do a little swatch. And you can do that as you mix it if you want, or come back later. And then I would like you to do the complementary colors. So do the complementary color. And let's just call them the complements. And so our complementary colors would be red and green. And remember that the complements are the ones that are opposite on the color wheel. Okay, so under that I would do that. And then of course there's going to be blue. And the opposite of blue on the color wheel is orange. And then the final one is going to be yellow and violet. And so you're going to have this on the side. And then what I'd like you to do is pick one section to do analogous. So in other words, you can just do a group, maybe a section of red, orange, and like I did here, just a little section of it. And they can fade into each other if you like. So what does the little swatch that I want you to paint need to look like? Super simple. Super simple. So if I'm doing the primaries, I'm just going to take a teeny touch of a red. Take a teeny touch of the blue. This will, I feel like, be far easier for you to do than trying to come in and do small circles like the diagram that's on the Google Doc. So those are my primaries. I would have to mix up my secondaries. So I would have to mix those over here. Don't cheat and use the ones that are here. Okay, and then let's say that I'm going to do my complements. I'm going to do, since I have a little bit of orange started, I'm going to do the blue and orange swatch. So I know that I need to get to pure orange. I need a little bit more yellow. So I'm going to do my orange. And my complement of blue. So it's just a small little marker so that I get that you know what these things mean, okay? And if I was going to do analogous, choose a section. You could do the blues, the greens, and the blue-greens. In this situation, since I already have this mixed, I'm going to do one with, starting with yellow. And analogous colors are groupings of 3 to 5 on the color wheel that are near each other. So now I'm going to need one that gives me my next one over, which would be my yellow-orange. So I'm going to take a teeny, teeny bit of red and mix into that. That is too orange. See, Miss T cheated. And now I have to suffer the consequences. So I'm going to have to add a little bit more yellow to that. See how I didn't panic though? It's all good. It's fine. And now we're going to come in and do, after yellow orange, we're just going to do plain orange. And then I could do red orange. And then I could do solid red. And it's just giving me a sense of how the colors work so that I know that you understand kind of what is expected and what these are. Okay? So I hope that this makes sense. This is our starting point. We will be coming back later to do more experimental stuff with our watercolor. Our next project will be using a combination of watercolor and another material. So we'll probably do the experimental methods with watercolor at a later time. All right, you guys, happy painting.